So Alan Turing, right. He is obviously super famous for breaking the Nazi Enigma code during World War II. But in 1952, he actually tried to break a completely different kind of code.
Yeah, a biological one?
Exactly, the mathematical algorithm that physically paints the spots on a leopard, which is just wild to think about. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a massive topic.
It really is.
Hmm.
So we are looking at a really comprehensive source on patterns in nature today. And our mission for this deep dive is basically to decode the invisible rules that are, governing the visible world around you.
Right.
Because, humans have always been totally obsessed with finding order and all the chaos, right?
Okay.
And today we are going to look at the actual engines driving that order.
Yeah, and that obsession goes, it goes all the way back to early Greek philosophers.
Oh, sure.
Like Pythagoras observed the harmonies of music and just assumed that mathematics was the basic constituent of all existence.
Wow, so everything is math.
Everything. He thought the universe was literally constructed out of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And then Plato took a similar path. He argued that the physical objects we see are just, imperfect copies of these ideal forms.
Like a rough draft.
Exactly. To Plato, a flower is just a messy, biological attempt at generating a perfect mathematical circle.
That's kind of a poetic way to look at it, actually. But for centuries, people were mostly just cataloging nature's art, right? They pointed at shapes, admired the symmetry, and that was kind of it.
Yeah, pretty much.
But crossing into the 20th century, the conversation shifts dramatically. We stop just observing the art, and we start looking for the algorithm that painted it.
Yes, and what's fascinating here is Turing's 1952 paper. It's called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, and it is a massive turning point.
Because he was a math and computer guy, not a biologist.
Right. He took the absolute mystery of biology and proposed that it was driven by very rigid physical and chemical rules.
Okay, so to understand how those rules operate, we kind of have to look at the intersection of three distinct fields, right? Math, physics, and biology.
The three pillars of pattern formation.
Right, the three pillars. Mathematics provides the abstract rules, like what is geometrically and logically possible in a given space.
Mm-hmm.
And then physics applies those rules to the real world, usually by seeking the lowest energy configurations or, equalizing pressure.
Yeah, physics enforces the math.
And then biology layers on natural selection. So if I'm visualizing this, it's like mathematics is the architectural blueprint detailing what can theoretically be built.
I like that.
Physics acts as the construction materials and the gravity, dictating how the house actually stands up in reality. And biology is like the interior decorator, deciding what modifications actually help the homeowner survive.
That's actually a great analogy.
But, I have to push back a little. How does a plant actually do this without knowing any math?
Well, it doesn't know math.
Right. If you look at a hazel tree, it isn't executing a literal computer program. It's not doing calculus. So what is physically forcing a plant to follow a mathematical blueprint?
So the plant relies entirely on physical constraints at a cellular level. Let's look at phyllotaxis.
Okay, phyllotaxis, which is...
It's the arrangement of leaves around a stem. For a plant to survive, obviously, it needs to maximize sunlight for photosynthesis.
Sure.
To achieve that, it has to arrange its leaves as far apart from each other as possible so the top leaves don't cast shadows on the ones below them.
Makes perfect sense.
Right. So at the very tip of a growing plant stem is the tiny cluster of cells called the shoot apical meristem. As the plant grows, it produces a hormone called auxin.
Okay, auxin.
And new leaves, which biologists call primordia, they only form where auxin concentrations are highest.
So the hormone acts as like a chemical trigger for a new leaf.
It does. And as a new leaf begins to grow, it acts as a sink. It literally drains the surrounding auxin.
Oh.
Yeah, so the next leaf can only form in a spot that is physically as far away from the previous leaves as possible, because it has to wait for a spot where the auxin has had time to build up again.
So it's literally a physical repulsion mechanism.
Exactly. The cells are essentially crowding each other out. And the most efficient way to pack those leaves around a cylindrical stem inherently generates a mathematical sequence.
Which brings us to the famous Fibonacci sequence.
Yes.
The sequence where each number is the sum of the two before it.
Right.
So 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so on.
That's the one.
And you can actually track the spiral of leaves up a hazel branch, and the ratio of turns to leaves is exactly 1/3.
Mm-hmm.
In an apricot tree, it is 2/5. In an almond tree, it is 5/13. I mean, it is astonishing that a chemical repulsion mechanism in the plant cells is forcing the growth into these exact mathematical ratios.
It really is. And the ultimate expression of that mathematical packing is the seed head of a sunflower.
Oh, right. The spirals on a sunflower are so mesmerizing.
Yeah, the seeds are arranged in a pattern known as Fermat spiral. As the seeds grow out from the center, they space themselves apart by a very specific measurement called the golden angle,
The golden angle.
which is exactly 137.508 degrees.
Okay, but why that specific angle? Like, what happens if a sunflower tries to place its seeds at a clean 137 degrees? Or, I don't know, maybe an even 90 degrees?
Well, if the plant used a simple, rational fraction of a circle, like exactly 1/4 or 1/3 of a rotation for each new seed, the seeds would quickly line up into straight, outward radiating rows.
Like spokes on a bicycle wheel.
Exactly. You would have these spokes of seeds, but with massive empty gaps between them as they got further from the center. It is highly inefficient.
Ah, I see.
But the golden ratio, which the golden angle is derived from, is known as the most irrational number.
Meaning it doesn't divide cleanly.
Right. It is the hardest number to approximate with a simple fraction. Because it never perfectly resolves into a repeating cycle, the seeds never align into straight rows.
They just keep staggering.
Exactly. They are forced to offset endlessly, packing together with absolutely no wasted space.
That's brilliant. And that kind of structural optimization applies to the larger architecture plants too, doesn't it?
It does.
Because Leonardo da Vinci actually observed this. He noted that all the branches of a tree at a given height add up to the exact thickness of the trunk below them.
Yes, Da Vinci's rule of trees.
Right. So if a parent branch splits into two child branches, the combined surface area of those children equals the parent. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at the cross-sectional diameters of that parent branch and the two child branches, they form a perfect right-angled triangle.
It's true. And biomechanical computer models have tested that exact geometry.
Oh, they have?
Yeah. That specific right-angled proportion allows the tree to distribute mechanical stress perfectly. It is literally the optimal structure to prevent snapping when the tree is subjected to the chaotic, uneven force of high winds during a storm.
Man, so it is just a pure algorithmic approach to survival.
Yes, which is exactly what Aristed Lindenmayer tapped into in the 1960s with L systems.
Oh, L systems.
Yeah, he realized that the branching of plants could be modeled using recursive computer algorithms. They operate on incredibly simple rewriting rules.
Like how simple?
Well, you start with an initial state, say, a single line representing a stem. The rule might dictate that every time the line grows a certain length, it must be replaced by a Y shape.
Okay.
Then the algorithm applies that exact same rule to the two new branches of the Y. They grow, and then they split into smaller Y shapes.
It's looping over and over.
Right. If you loop that recursive algorithm enough times, the output is a highly realistic, self-similar branching structure that perfectly mirrors a fern or a shrub.
Which sounds exactly like fractals, because Benoit Mandelbrot popularized the mathematics of fractals later on, right? Shapes that are infinitely self-similar.
He did, but there is a massive distinction between a mathematical fractal on a computer and what we actually see in the woods behind our houses.
Because nature has limits.
Exactly. Nature's fractals are restricted by biology. Biological energy is finite.
Right.
A true mathematical fractal zooms in infinitely. You can magnify it forever and see the exact same pattern. But when you look at a biological fractal like cow parsley or a fern, you see that repeating, self-similar branching pattern. But the recursion stops after 3 or 4 levels.
It just gives up.
Well, the biological mechanism simply runs out of energy. Or it reaches a cellular limit where the physical materials just can no longer support the geometry.
That makes total sense. So we have been talking pretty heavily about biology optimizing itself to survive.
Yes.
But we see these identical geometries in materials that are completely inanimate too. Dirt, water, rock, things that are not trying to survive at all.
Right, and that's where things get really pure. Without biology layering on those survival pressures, you get to witness pure physics attempting to equalize energy.
Oh, well.
Like in the 19th century, this physicist, Joseph Plateau, he formulated laws governing soap bubbles and foams. Yeah. A soap bubble is essentially a liquid film seeking the absolute minimal possible surface area to contain a given volume of air.
Because of surface tension.
Exactly. And because of that surface tension, the angles at which bubbles join are mathematically rigid. 3 soap films will always meet at an exact 120-degree angle.
Always.
Always. And 4 edges meeting at a corner will always meet at about 109.5 degrees.
Wow. And the forces dictating how hard materials break apart operate on similar rigid rules, don't they?
They do.
Like, the pattern of a crack on a surface is essentially just a geological footprint of the material's elasticity.
Exactly right.
If you picture the drying mudflats in Sicily or those massive basalt columns at the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, those materials are elastic.
Right. When an elastic material like mud or cooling basalt dries and contracts, it shrinks uniformly. The tension is pulling equally in all directions simultaneously.
So how does it break?
Well, to relieve that uniform physical stress across the surface, the material fails at 120-degree junctions.
Which creates hexagons.
Exactly. It creates a vast network of hexagonal columns. It is literally the physics of energy dispersal perfectly resolving itself into geometry.
That is wild. But, okay, if you drop your favorite ceramic coffee mug, or you look at the old glaze cracking on a piece of pottery, you don't see hexagons.
No, you don't.
You see straight lines intersecting at 90 degrees. So what is happening at the molecular level that forces an inelastic material to choose a completely different angle?
So an inelastic material like ceramic cannot stretch to distribute tension. When the stress builds up enough to cause a tiny micro tear, all the kinetic energy and stress within that area concentrates intensely at the very tip of that newly formed crack.
Like tearing a piece of paper.
Yeah, exactly. And the physics of fracture mechanics dictate that to relieve that localized tearing stress as fast as possible, the crack must propagate perpendicular to the direction of greatest tension.
Okay, so it tears in a straight line.
Right. And then when another crack forms and approaches it, the stress fields around the cracks interact, and that physical interaction forces the new crack to intersect the existing one at exactly 90 degrees.
That is just incredible. Okay, let's scale up from microscopic stress fields to massive chaotic movement.
Okay.
Because wind feels entirely random to us. Water rushing down a mountain seems completely chaotic. Yet, a chaotic wind creates perfectly uniform sand dunes. How does that happen?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, chaos and flow are still bound by the strict properties of the materials involved.
Even sand.
Even sand. Take Barshan dunes. Those are the crescent-shaped dunes you find in deserts like the Taklamakan. Their formation relies entirely on a nonlinear threshold, governed by gravity and friction.
A nonlinear threshold.
Yeah. The wind blows sand up the back of the dune, which sits at a relatively gentle 15-degree incline. The sand reaches the crest and starts accumulating on the steep side, which is called the slip face.
And because it's a nonlinear threshold, the reaction isn't gradual, right? Like millions of grains of sand can just pile up on that slip face, and the dune holds its structure perfectly.
Exactly. Nothing happens until the slope hits a very specific point, called the angle of repose, which, for dry sand, is about 35 degrees.
So at 34 degrees, nothing.
Nothing. But at that precise mathematical limit of 35 degrees, the gravitational pull finally overcomes the friction holding the grains together. One single tiny grain of sand pushes the slope over that threshold, and the entire face avalanches down.
Wow.
And that constant cycle of accumulation and collapse is what maintains that perfect crescent shape as the dune just slowly marches across the desert floor.
It's just a physical feedback loop.
Yes.
Which is funny because water flowing through a landscape does the exact same thing when it's forming river meanders, right?
It does. A river meander is basically a textbook positive feedback loop,
Yeah.
driven by fluid dynamics.
Okay, walk me through that.
So water flows down a slightly uneven channel. The moment the path curves even a tiny fraction of a degree, the dynamics of the water completely change. The surface water, which is moving faster, swings toward the outside of the curve due to centrifugal force.
Just like a car taking a sharp turn.
Exactly. It hits the outer bank, gets pushed down to the riverbed, and then sweeps back across the bottom toward the inner bank.
So it creates a sort of corkscrew effect.
Yes. We call it a helical flow. And that corkscrewing water drags sediment and gravel from the outer bank and deposits it over on the inner bank.
Right.
Now, because the outer bank is being stripped of material, the water erodes it even faster, making the curve sharper.
And the sharper the curve,
the stronger the helical flow becomes, which just accelerates the erosion even more. So a tiny random wobble in a stream mathematically scales into those massive, dramatic, looping river meanders you see when you look out the window of an airplane.
It's fascinating how small things scale up like that. Okay, so we have tracked how physics forces inanimate materials into hexagons and right angles and spirals. But let's bring this back to the living world for a minute. Because Darwin's theory of evolution perfectly explains why a leopard needs spots.
Camouflage. It provides a predatory advantage.
Exactly. But Darwin does not explain how the leopard's biology actually physically paints a black spot onto a yellow coat in the womb.
No, he doesn't. And that brings us full circle to Alan Turing's reaction diffusion system.
Right, from the beginning.
Yeah. Turing hypothesized that inside a developing embryo, there are these chemical signals called morphogens. These chemicals diffuse through the tissue, and they activate specific genes, like the genes responsible for producing melanin.
Okay, let me try to bridge the math of this to the actual cellular chemistry because it can get dense. So what does this all mean? The common analogy I've heard is a painter and an eraser.
That's a great one.
So the painter represents an activator morphogen, right? A chemical gradient that turns on pigment production, make it black. And the eraser represents an inhibitor morphogen, a chemical that blocks pigment. Leave it yellow. If both chemicals are diffusing across an embryo at the same time, but the inhibitor diffuses through the cell slightly faster than the activator, they essentially get locked into this complex chemical tug-of-war.
That is exactly what happens. The activator turns the pigment on locally, but the faster-moving inhibitor surrounds that little pocket of pigment and stops it from spreading any further.
Wow.
And depending on the exact diffusion rates of these two chemicals, their specific wavelengths and frequencies, they settle into mathematical standing waves. The peaks of those waves are areas of high pigment concentration.
And to our eyes, those concentration peaks look like leopard spots.
Or zebra stripes, or the patches on a giraffe. It's all the same basic mechanism.
And Turing proposed that all the way back in 1952, using purely theoretical math.
He did.
But scientists have since matched this to actual biology, right? It's not just a theory anymore.
No, it's very real. For instance, evolutionary biologist Richard Prum utilized Turing's activation-inhibition models to study bird feathers. Prum used 6 specific mathematical variables representing these chemical diffusion rates, and he successfully simulated 9 basic feather patterns.
Wait, really? Just by tweaking the diffusion rates in a mathematical model, he recreated the exact physical patterns found on real birds?
Perfectly. Look at the helmeted guinea fowl.
Okay.
Its feathers feature these horizontal bars at the base, but as you move toward the tip of the feather, those solid bars break apart into a very complex, staggered array of individual dots.
That's a drastic change.
It is. And Prum demonstrated that this pattern change is caused by the chemical signals literally oscillating in both space and time as the feather grows out of the follicle. The chemical rhythm naturally shifts, the standing wave breaks up, and a solid stripe mathematically degrades into a series of spots.
That is just an incredible journey through the mechanics of the natural world. I mean, from the auxin gradients pushing plant cells into the Fibonacci sequence, to the irrational geometry of the golden angle packing those sunflower seeds so tightly.
It's all connected.
It really is. We've looked at how molecular stress forces brittle glaze to crack at exactly 90 degrees, and how a chemical tug-of-war diffuses through an embryo just to paint a leopard's coat. It changes how you see things.
It does. And this raises an important question, actually. We have spent this entire deep dive examining patterns in plants, the earth, animals.
Yeah.
But consider the physical structure of the human mind that is actually recognizing all these patterns.
You mean like the folds of the brain, the geri and sulci?
Exactly. For a long time, the exact mechanism causing the brain to fold like that was heavily debated in biology.
Sure.
But researchers eventually built these physical models, starting with smooth, layered gels representing the brain's developing cortex. When they introduced a solvent, causing the outer layer of the gel to expand, that outer layer was physically constrained by the non-expanding layers beneath it. And under that intense compressive mechanical force, the gel buckled, and it folded.
Wait, so the folds of the human brain are just another mechanical buckling pattern?
The physical fissures of your brain are caused by the exact same physical process of constrained expansion that we observe in other natural materials. It is literally just an equalizer of physical stress.
Wow. Think about the implications of that for a second.
I know, it's deep.
The next time you step outside and you recognize a pattern, whether you are looking at the spiral of a snail shell, or the cracking mud on a hiking trail, or a leopard at the zoo, consider what is actually happening in your head.
Yeah.
Is it just your brain recognizing the very same physical and mathematical forces that physically sculpted the brain itself? By observing nature's patterns, we might simply be nature looking in a mirror.
It's a profound thought to leave on.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The invisible rules are everywhere once you know how to read them. Imagine stepping into like a luxury boutique in Paris or New York.
Hmm.
You pick up a high-end designer perfume.
Right, the kind that costs hundreds of dollars a bottle.
Exactly. And you probably aren't thinking about global geopolitics when you smell it, right?
Definitely not.
But there is a very good chance that the foundational ingredient in that bottle, this essential root called vetiver, was painstakingly pulled from the soil of a country that currently, as of 2023, has literally 0 elected officials.
It's a profound disconnect, isn't it? We see the luxury product on one end of the supply chain, and then we see the chaotic headlines on the other.
Yeah.
But we almost never, connect the two.
And those headlines are just relentless. I mean, you open any news app today, and the words associated with the Republic of Haiti are almost always like crisis or gang violence or failed state.
Right. It paints this picture of a place that is just permanently broken.
Which is why today we're taking a deep dive into a really comprehensive Wikipedia article on the Republic of Haiti. And our mission here is to completely dismantle that snapshot.
I love that.
We want to figure out how a nation with, honestly, one of the most triumphant history-making foundings in the world evolved into the complex, hyper-vulnerable state we see today.
Yeah, because to understand the Haiti on your screen right now, you really have to look at the historical mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this.
You literally cannot understand the gang violence or the institutional collapse without understanding the 2 centuries of economic starvation and geopolitical manipulation that preceded it.
So consider this deep dive your historical skeleton key. Let's trace this back to the 18th century, when the western third of the island of Hispaniola was a French colony called Saint-Domingue.
Right.
And just reading the source material, the sheer scale of the wealth being extracted from this land is, I mean, it's almost difficult to wrap your head around.
It really is. It earned the title the Pearl of the Antilles for a reason. This single, relatively small colony was generating 40% of France's entire foreign trade.
Wow, 40%.
To put that in perspective, Saint-Domingue was producing double the wealth of all of England's colonies combined.
That is just wild.
It was the absolute economic engine of the French Empire, and it was fueled entirely by the mass export of sugar and coffee.
But, and this is the crucial part, the mechanism generating that wealth was an absolute meat grinder.
Yeah, brutal is an understatement.
The plantation system here wasn't just cruel, it was engineered for this lethal level of efficiency. The French settlers were outnumbered by enslaved Africans 10 to 1.
10 to 1.
And the working conditions were so extreme that a third of all newly imported enslaved people died within just a few years.
Right, because the underlying logic of the system was to literally consume human lives for maximum profit.
It's horrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
It was actually considered cheaper by the plantation owners to just work people to death and constantly import a massive influx of newly enslaved people from Africa than it was to, sustain a living workforce.
So you build a pressure cooker with a 10 to 1 ratio of oppressed to oppressors, and you turn the heat up that high, an explosion is basically a mathematical certainty.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804. And this isn't just a regional rebellion. Haiti becomes the first sovereign state in the Caribbean, the first country in the Americas to officially abolish slavery, and
it remains the only country in human history established by a successful slave revolt.
it's incredible.
The military achievement here requires serious pause, I think. These were self-emancipated people going toe-to-toe with the absolute superpower of the era.
Napoleon's army.
Exactly, Napoleonic France.
Mm.
Napoleon sent an expedition of 20,000 soldiers, plus an equal number of sailors, with the explicit goal of retaking the colony and reinstating slavery.
And the Haitian forces, led by tacticians like Toussaint Louverture and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, they didn't just meet them on an open battlefield, right? They utilized these devastating guerrilla tactics.
They did.
Plus, they had this massive invisible ally, which was yellow fever.
Yes, a huge factor.
The source notes that more than 50,000 French troops ultimately died trying to take back the colony, many from the disease. That includes 18 generals.
Which is staggering.
France lost more soldiers in Haiti than in multiple other 19th century colonial campaigns combined.
Because the Haitian armies essentially weaponized the environment. They dragged the war out, forcing the French troops into conditions where disease just decimated their ranks.
So it was a humiliating, decisive defeat for Napoleon. And on January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared its independence.
Right.
But I have a question about the global reaction to this, specifically from the United States.
Okay.
Because I always assumed the U.S. would have been the first to champion Haiti's independence. We had just fought our own bloody revolution against a European monarchy. Wouldn't the U.S. want a newly independent, democratic neighbor?
You would definitely think so, but the reality was this severe case of geopolitical whiplash.
What do you mean?
United States support for the Haitian revolutionaries was entirely dependent on who was sitting in the Oval Office at the time.
Ah, because the concept of a successful slave revolt was like a massive domestic political issue for the U.S.
Exactly. So John Adams, who was an abolitionist, actually threw his weight behind the Haitian uprising.
Really?
Yeah. During his presidency, he provided diplomatic recognition, crucial financial support, munitions, and he even deployed U.S. Navy warships to assist the revolutionaries.
That is incredible. The U.S. Navy actively helping a slave revolt.
It is. But then the pendulum swings violently when Thomas Jefferson takes office in 1801.
Because Jefferson was a slaveholder.
Right. He looks at Saint-Domingue and is absolutely terrified by the precedent. He fears this is going to inspire uprisings in the American South.
So what does he do?
He immediately cuts off all support, recalls the Navy, and imposes an embargo. The United States wouldn't formally recognize Haitian independence for another 6 decades.
Wait, really?
Not until 1862.
Wait, really? So the global superpower next door isolates them. And that isolation sets the stage for what I think is, honestly, the most infuriating part of this history. Yes. You read about them defeating Napoleon and you think, okay, that's the finish line. They won. But the global powers essentially invented a whole new set of rules just to ensure Haiti couldn't thrive.
Well, a newly independent nation desperately needs diplomatic recognition to engage in global trade,
Right.
to build an economy.
Right.
But Haiti was completely frozen out. Then in 1825, France returns to the island. But they don't bring an invading army this time. They bring a fleet of warships and an ultimatum.
The 1825 debt.
Yes.
King Charles X of France demands that Haiti pay 150 million francs to compensate French planters for their lost property. And to be perfectly clear, that lost property included the formerly enslaved people themselves.
Exactly. It's paying for their own bodies.
And if Haiti didn't pay, they wouldn't get diplomatic recognition, and they faced the threat of a military blockade.
It is essentially the invention of neocolonialism.
Right.
The French realized they didn't need to physically occupy the land if they could just permanently own the nation's balance sheet.
The audacity of this is staggering. Let me offer an analogy to ground this for you, the listener.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you are kidnapped. You endure years of horrific abuse, but you finally fight off your captor and escape. You are free.
Right.
But then your kidnapper tracks you down, surrounds your house with armed guards, and legally sues you for the loss of their property, meaning you.
Wow.
And to avoid being killed, you have to agree to take out predatory payday loans for the next 120 years just to exist in your own neighborhood.
The math on that analogy honestly holds up perfectly, because that 150 million francs translates to roughly $560 million today.
$500 million.
And Haiti was a brand new nation. Its infrastructure was burned to the ground during the revolution. They obviously didn't have that kind of capital.
So what did they do?
To pay the ransom to France, Haiti was forced to take out massive loans from Western banks at exorbitant interest rates.
So they are paying the ransom, and they are paying the interest on the money they borrowed to pay the ransom. I want you to think about the taxes deducted from your paycheck right now. Imagine if your local government couldn't use that money to pave roads or build schools or fund a fire department, because 80% of the entire municipal budget was legally required to be shipped to a foreign bank.
And that was Haiti's reality by 1900. 80% of the government's entire operating budget went solely to servicing this debt.
80%. That leaves nothing.
Exactly. While other nations in the 19th and early 20th centuries were laying down railways, establishing public education systems, and building modern infrastructure, Haiti was systematically bleeding its wealth back to its former oppressors.
And they didn't finish paying off this debt until when?
Not until 1947.
1947. The source estimates the lost economic growth over that century plus of extortion is somewhere between $21 billion and $115 billion.
Which fundamentally alters the trajectory of a country. I mean, a state that bankrupts simply cannot build institutions.
It's like trying to build a Jenga tower, but someone has systematically removed all the foundational blocks before you even start stacking.
That's a great way to look at it.
And a tower that fragile practically invites outside interference, which moves us into the compounding crises of the 20th century.
Right. The financial vacuum created by that debt made Haiti incredibly vulnerable to foreign occupation. From 1915 to 1934, the United States military occupied the country.
And this occupation was basically a masterclass in how to build physical infrastructure while simultaneously destroying social trust.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources detail how the U.S. military built hospitals, bridges, and 1,700 kilometers of roads. But the mechanism they used to do it was horrifying.
They implemented the corvée system.
Which is?
It was a policy that allowed them to take Haitians from their homes and farms, often at gunpoint,
Oh my God.
and force them to do unpaid manual labor to build those roads.
Think about the psychological impact of that. In a nation whose entire identity is rooted in the only successful slave revolt in human history, you have a foreign military forcing citizens to do unpaid manual labor at the barrel of a gun.
Yeah,
The resentment that generated must have been immeasurable.
it was. The corvée system deeply alienated the population from the state apparatus. It centralized power and resources in the capital, Port-au-Prince, and it set a terrifying precedent for authoritarian control backed by military force.
So they essentially laid the blueprint for internal strongmen to take over once the Americans left.
Exactly, which perfectly sets the stage for the Duvalier dynasty.
Right. Papa Doc François Duvalier gets elected in 1957, declares himself president for life, and is later succeeded by his son, Baby Doc Jean-Claude Duvalier, who rules all the way until 1986.
And to maintain an absolute grip on power, Papa Doc bypassed the traditional military entirely and established a private, notoriously brutal militia called the Tontons Macoutes.
Which translates to what?
It essentially translates to the bogeymen.
Jesus.
Yeah, and they didn't act as a police force. Their function was to maintain order through sheer terror, extortion, and political assassination.
The human toll is devastating. The source estimates 40,000 to 60,000 Haitians murdered.
It's horrific.
But beyond the immediate bloodshed, I want to unpack the long-term mechanism of destruction here. The source material highlights a massive brain drain during the Duvalier years.
Right.
How does that specifically cripple a country decades later?
Well, when a regime targets anyone who might pose an intellectual or political threat, the people who have the means to flee do. So Haiti saw a mass exodus of its educated middle class.
We're talking doctors, teachers.
Doctors, teachers, lawyers, civil servants, engineers, the very people required to operate a functional society.
Right.
If you lose a generation of teachers, you don't just have empty classrooms for a few years.
Right.
You have a massive deficit in literacy and technical skill 20 years down the line. If you lose your civil servants, your courts stop functioning. The institutional capacity of the state is totally gutted, and Haiti has never truly recovered that lost human capital.
So let's look at our Jenga tower now. The foundation was pulled out by a century of debt. The middle blocks were smashed by forced labor and dictatorial terror. The educated professionals who could have rebuilt it were driven out. And then, on top of all of that, the natural disasters hit.
Because the geographic reality of Haiti makes it exceptionally vulnerable. It is the most mountainous country in the Caribbean, situated directly on major seismic fault lines and squarely in the path of Atlantic hurricane corridors.
Fast forward to January 2010, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake strikes dangerously close to the densely populated capital of Port-au-Prince.
Yeah.
The statistics from the Wikipedia article are just harrowing. Up to 300,000 people dead, 1.6 million left homeless.
Unbelievable.
80% of the schools and over half the hospitals in the affected area simply ceased to exist.
And the earthquake didn't just destroy buildings, it physically crushed the remaining hollowed-out state.
What do you mean by physically crushed?
Well, ministries literally collapsed.
Yeah.
Government records were buried, and countless civil servants were killed in the rubble. But then the tragedy was immediately compounded by a secondary disaster. And this one was entirely human-made.
The cholera outbreak.
Exactly. Cholera was not endemic to Haiti prior to 2010. The outbreak was directly traced to a United Nations peacekeeping station.
I remember reading this.
Yeah, infected waste from that camp contaminated the Artibonite River, which is the country's main water source.
I am still trying to process the cruel irony of that. An international stabilization force sent to help manage the aftermath of an earthquake triggers a deadly epidemic that kills roughly 10,000 people.
It's a cascade of systemic failures.
It really is. But I want to tie this back to the beginning of our deep dive. How do we draw the line from the 2010 earthquake to the headlines today? Like, how do we arrive at a country with 0 elected officials, completely overrun by gangs?
The mechanism is a complete power vacuum.
Okay.
The state was fundamentally hollowed out by the debt, the brain drain, and the physical destruction of 2010. Whatever fragile political order remained was entirely shattered in July 2021 when President Jovenel Moise was assassinated in his own home.
The final Jenga block gets pulled.
Precisely. You have no functioning parliament, an understaffed and outgunned police force, and a dysfunctional high court. Heavily armed gangs recognized the void, and they just stepped into it.
And the numbers are terrifying. By late 2023, the source notes that gangs controlled an estimated 80% of Port-au-Prince.
80%?
They displaced over 360,000 people. And because the violence makes it impossible to hold elections, the terms of all previous lawmakers simply expired.
The state literally evaporated.
It is a staggering sequence of events, but, if we stop the analysis here, if we only look at the collapsed tower, we miss the table it's built on.
That's very true.
We miss the land, the culture, and the millions of people who actually make up the Republic of Haiti. The resilience described in the source material is profound.
And that resilience is embedded in the name itself.
Oh, yeah.
Haiti derives from the indigenous Taino language, meaning land of high mountains. Long before European colonization, the island had a complex indigenous history. The land itself is really a core character in this story.
Which brings me back to the vetiver we talked about at the very beginning.
Right, the perfume route.
Even with the government completely absent, the global economy is still extracting value from Haitian soil. Haiti remains the world's leading producer of vetiver.
It's wild to think about.
Half of the global supply of this essential ingredient for luxury European perfumes is harvested there.
It forces us to really reconsider what a failed state actually means. The political apparatus has failed, yes.
Barely.
But the agricultural workers are still cultivating crops that anchor multi-billion-dollar global supply chains. The people are still working, they're still producing value.
And that enduring spirit extends deeply into the cultural and religious fabric as well. The religious landscape in Haiti is fascinating in the sources.
It is.
The data shows about 87% of the population identifies as Christian, primarily Catholic and Protestant. But concurrently, 50 to 80% of Haitians incorporate elements of Haitian voodoo into their daily lives.
And to understand the mechanics of that, you have to look back to those brutal French plantations in Saint-Domingue.
Because it started as resistance.
Exactly. The French strictly forbade traditional African religions and forced enslaved people to be baptized as Catholics.
But the enslaved Africans didn't just passively accept that erasure. They engaged in this brilliant strategy of syncretism.
Yes. Syncretism wasn't merely a blending of beliefs, it was an active survival mechanism.
Oh, so.
They took their traditional West African spirits, known as La, and disguised them as Catholic saints.
Oh, wow.
They used the iconography of their oppressors to secretly maintain their own spiritual traditions, their community bonds, and ultimately their identities.
It was an act of profound cultural resistance playing out right in front of the plantation owners.
Right under their noses.
So when you see that modern blending of Catholicism and voodoo today, you aren't looking at a contradiction. You are looking at the living legacy of a people who engineered a way to survive an unsurvivable system.
The history of Haiti is not a story of passive victimhood. It really is a story of incredible agency constantly colliding with overwhelming external force.
Which perfectly frames our mission for this deep dive. Haiti isn't simply a tragic place cursed by bad luck. It is a nation that executed an impossible, world-changing revolution against the greatest military power of its day.
And for daring to do so, it was systematically economically starved for over a century.
Manipulated by foreign powers.
Terrorized by internal dictators.
And battered by geography.
When you understand the underlying mechanics, the modern headlines actually make terrifying sense.
They really do.
When you see a notification about gang violence in Port-au-Prince, you are looking at the downstream compounding effects of 1825, of 1915, of 1957, and of 2010.
It is all interconnected. Now, as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked a lot about the historical barriers to Haiti's success, but there is this invisible barrier operating inside the country every single day.
Yeah, the source material highlights a severe linguistic divide. There are two official languages in Haiti, French and Haitian Creole. French is the language of administration. It is the language of the legal system, the press, and the elite class. But only about 42% of the population actually speaks it.
Wait, only 42%?
Yep. Meanwhile, Haitian Creole is spoken by virtually 100% of the population. And crucially, over half the country only speaks Creole.
Which raises a fundamental question about governance, doesn't it?
Absolutely. How can a nation fully heal overcome these massive historical challenges, and build a unified, functional democracy when the very language of its legal, educational, and political institutions is completely incomprehensible to the vast majority of its own citizens.
Think about what that means on a daily basis. You go to court, you interact with a government agency, and the official documents dictating your life are written in a language you do not understand.
It acts as an invisible wall.
Exactly. Keeping the majority of the population locked out of their own governance, it completely reframes how you look at the concept of a failed state. Is the state failing to function, or was it historically designed to exclude?
That's a powerful question.
So tomorrow, when you look at the news, remember, the snapshot isn't the whole story. The car didn't just break down spontaneously, right? The brakes were cut, the road was rigged, and the toll booths charged a fortune.
Well said.
But the engine, the resilient spirit of Haiti, is still there. Thank you so much for joining us and taking this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
So the next time you hit play on a 45-minute album on Spotify or, queue up a playlist on your phone, I want you to realize something kind of crazy. You are actually obeying the physical limitations of this fragile 12-inch piece of plastic that was engineered all the way back in 1948.
Yeah, it's wild. It is entirely dictated by a format.
Right. Every time you just accept that 10 to 12 tracks is like the natural fundamental unit of music, you are basically being haunted by a mid-century ghost.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the album isn't some fundamental law of physics. It's a very specific commercial package that was invented, and then it evolved, suffered a highly publicized collapse, and then somehow it mutated to survive the digital age.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we're doing a deep dive into a really comprehensive historical breakdown of the album era. And our mission here is to figure out exactly how a physical piece of vinyl completely dictated the way artists created music, how we all consumed it, and, what it means for the way you listen to music today.
And to really get that, we have to start at the very beginning of the technology. We have to look at why the album even exists in the first place.
Because if we want to understand why your favorite artist just dropped a 12-track project today, we have to look at the mechanical constraints of the early 20th century. We have to talk about shellac.
Yes, shellac. So before 1948, recorded music was sold on these 78 RPM gramophone records.
Right.
And these were made from shellac resin, which was, frankly, incredibly heavy and just notoriously brittle.
Like drop it and it shatters into a million pieces brittle.
Exactly. But the really big limitation, the one that shaped everything, was the physical space on the disc. The grooves had to be cut so wide and the disc spun so fast that you could only fit about maybe 3 to 5 minutes of audio onto a single side.
Which completely dictated how a human being could even compose a piece of music for the public. I mean, you couldn't record a sprawling 20-minute jazz improvisation or a full symphony movement without just abruptly cutting the performance off.
Because you literally ran out of real estate on the disc. Think of cutting audio into shellac like trying to write a story in wet sand with a thick stick.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, you just run out of room almost immediately. So if a record label wanted to sell you, say, a classical symphony or a collection of pop songs by one artist, they couldn't just give you one record. They had to press multiple shellac discs and bind them together.
And they sold them in these heavy brown paper booklets, right? With these really rigid spines.
Yes, and because those booklets looked absolutely identical to a standard family photo album, consumers just naturally started calling them record albums.
Which is just so fascinating. The literal name of the packaging became the name of the art form itself.
It did. The terminology stuck permanently, even though the technological barrier was finally broken in 1948. That's when Columbia Records introduced the 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM long-playing record. The LP.
The format we all know and love.
Right. They abandoned that brittle shellac for polyvinyl chloride, which was vastly quieter and just so much more durable.
So going back to your sand metaphor, vinyl basically let engineers use a fine-tip pen instead of a thick stick.
Precisely. They developed what was called a microgroove stylus. And because the material was smoother and stronger, they could cut much narrower grooves, pack them incredibly close together, and slow the rotation speed down to 33 1/3.
Wow.
So suddenly, a single disc could hold up to 52 minutes of music. 26 minutes per side.
That is such a massive leap. It's the equivalent of going from, like, only being allowed to read short stories your entire life to suddenly being handed the structural capacity of a full novel.
It really was.
But it's interesting to note who actually jumped on this new canvas first. Because it wasn't the early rock and roll artists like Elvis, it was actually jazz musicians. Guys like Duke Ellington, who could finally capture that hypnotic, uninterrupted flow of a live club performance.
Oh, absolutely. Jazz was huge for the early LP.
And Broadway, too. I read in the source that the original cast recording of My Fair Lady actually became the very first LP to sell 1 million copies, because it could finally fit an entire theatrical narrative onto a single disc.
Right, whereas pop and rock were still totally driven by the 45 RPM 7-inch single. The pop album in the 1950s was really just an afterthought.
Just a vehicle for the single.
Exactly. Labels would have a massive hit single, and then they would hastily record like 9 or 10 mediocre filler tracks just to pad out a piece of vinyl and charge a premium price for it.
Now, I actually want to challenge the accepted mythology here for a second.
Okay, lay it on me.
Whenever we talk about the album elevating from this, like cheap cash grab into a cohesive artistic statement, the concept album, everyone immediately points to the Beatles in the mid-60s.
Sure, yeah.
But looking at the timeline from our deep dive, Frank Sinatra was actually doing this a full decade earlier. He released In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, carefully sequencing these really moody, thematically linked songs about loneliness and heartbreak.
That's true.
And Ray Charles was doing it too. Plus, the Beach Boys actually beat everyone to the punch in 1963 with Little Deuce Coupe, which is a concept album of almost entirely original songwriting, all about car culture.
Well, I will defend the Beatles' placement in history here while totally conceding the groundwork you just mentioned.
Fair enough.
Sinatra undeniably linked songs thematically, but those were still largely interpretations of standards. What happens with the Beatles, specifically with Rubber Soul in late 1965, is this profound shift in intent and really cultural weight.
How so?
It wasn't just a mood anymore. It was a mandate that an album should contain 0 filler. Every single song had to hold its own weight.
I see the distinction. Sinatra established the mood, but the Beatles established the album as a completely self-contained universe of original creation.
Exactly, which is what triggers the real explosion in 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Rolling Stone magazine literally called it the Big Bang of albums.
Big Bang, yeah.
And for good reason. It was the exact moment the album stopped being just a container for a radio tour and became a primary multimedia product.
Because it wasn't just the music. It came in this lavish gatefold sleeve. It had a printed lyric sheet on the back, which, prior to that, was virtually unheard of. You could actually sit there and read along with the band.
It demanded to be taken seriously as a piece of high art, akin to a great film or a novel. And economically, it proved to the entire industry that young consumers would gladly pay top dollar for these long-form, complex artistic statements.
And that totally sets the stage for the 1970s, which is widely considered the golden age of the LP.
Without a doubt.
There's this music journalist in the source material, James Campion, and he uses a phrase to describe the 1970s album experience that I just think is brilliant. He calls it an imagination capsule.
I love that. It captures the psychology of the era perfectly.
Right. I want you to really think about the sensory reality of a teenager in the 1970s. You couldn't just pull up a YouTube video to entertain yourself. You often couldn't even control the single-family television in the living room.
You had to watch whatever your parents were watching.
Exactly. So your only escape, your only refuge, was to retreat to your bedroom. You'd drop the needle on the turntable, put on a pair of those huge, heavy over-ear headphones, turn on a mood lamp, and literally lock yourself inside this auditory dreamscape.
You became a totally captive audience.
You studied the liner notes, the gatefold art, every little cryptic symbol on the cardboard, while the music just completely enveloped you.
And the artists knew this. They leaned entirely into that physical environment. Knowing you were listening in the dark with headphones on, they experimented with all this intricate stereo panning, like making a guitar sweep slowly from your left ear over to your right.
Oh man, hearing that for the first time must have been mind-blowing.
It was revolutionary. Furthermore, the physical limitations of the vinyl record turned track sequencing into this deeply under-recognized art form. Because you had to physically stand up and flip the record after 22 minutes, artists deliberately crafted these epic side A finales to leave you in suspense.
Wow.
And then they'd write specific side B openers to pull you right back in.
I think we also need to broaden the lens of this golden age, though. Because when people hear 70s concept album, the immediate mental images, like a white progressive rock band like Pink Floyd creating the Dark Side of the Moon.
Sure, that's the cliche.
But the soul and R&B pioneers were pushing the boundaries of that imagination capsule just as hard, if not harder.
Oh, absolutely.
Isaac Hayes released Hot Buttered Soul in 1969, and it featured just 4 incredibly lush, sprawling tracks. And then you have Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder, who had to actively fight Motown executives.
Because Motown was strictly focused on churning out radio singles.
Right, they were a hit factory.
Yeah.
But Gaye and Wonder fought them to win the creative control to produce these sweeping, politically charged masterworks like What's Going On and Songs in the Key of Life.
They proved beyond a doubt that the LP was the ultimate artistic measuring stick across every single genre. But as we know, that deep, solitary listening experience couldn't last forever.
The world got a lot louder.
It did. The neon glare of the 1980s completely shattered that bedroom window. We step out of the imagination capsule and into this highly visual corporate blockbuster era driven by MTV and a shiny new format, the compact disc.
The CD, it fundamentally changes the psychology of the album. Because with MTV putting the visual component front and center, an album is no longer just a record you listen to in the dark. It becomes the epicenter of a massive multimedia marketing event.
It became the extended roll-out model. Michael Jackson and Madonna really perfected this.
Oh, totally.
You didn't just drop a record and hope people bought it anymore. You released a meticulously produced lead single. You debuted a cinematic, multi-million-dollar music video on MTV just to dominate the cultural conversation.
Which was an event in itself.
Exactly. Then came the merchandise, the media blitz, and a spectacular global tour. The album was literally engineered to sustain commercial momentum for an entire calendar year or even more.
And as the mainstream pop world was becoming this massive blockbuster visual medium, hip-hop was simultaneously entering its own golden age. But it was fueled almost entirely by the discarded artifacts of the previous generation.
This is honestly one of the most beautiful instances of technological recycling in all of music history. By the late 80s and 90s, acts like Run DMC, Public Enemy, and the Beastie Boys proved that hip-hop albums could be these massive, cohesive cultural events.
But the mechanics of how those albums were actually built is the fascinating part to me.
Right.
As suburban consumers were abandoning their dusty vinyl LPs for these shiny new CDs, hip-hop producers were out there crate digging in thrift stores. They were hunting down forgotten 1970s funk and soul records.
They were looking for the raw materials.
Exactly. They would manually scrub the vinyl back and forth just to find an isolated 2-second drum break. Then they'd sample it into a drum machine and loop it to create an entirely new beat. So the forgotten physical vinyl of the 70s literally became the mechanical foundation of 90s hip-hop.
Or the old technology became the actual instrument for the new technology. But looking at the new technology itself, the CD, we run into a really precarious economic situation.
Yeah, this is the great irony of the 90s music industry, because on paper, it looks like an absolute triumph. By 1999, the industry is raking in an unprecedented $15 billion in revenue.
Huge numbers.
You have alternative rock explosions like Nirvana's Nevermind and massive country crossovers like Shania Twain, all moving tens of millions of CDs. But beneath the surface, the CD was actually destroying the structural integrity of the album itself.
What's fascinating here is that the immense profitability of the CD planted the exact seeds of its own destruction. It basically comes down to greed and capacity.
Okay, break that down.
Well, a CD was significantly cheaper to manufacture than a vinyl record. But record labels drastically increased the retail price anyway. Consumers were suddenly paying $18 for a new CD.
Which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
And a CD can hold about 74 minutes of audio, right? Compared to the 40 to 50 minutes of an LP.
Exactly. Which created a massive psychological trap. If a consumer is paying a premium $18, they expect to get their money's worth. So labels pressured artists to utilize that entire 74-minute capacity.
Oh, right.
This caused an absolute epidemic of filler. Instead of a tight, cohesive 40-minute artistic statement, you were getting an hour and 15 minutes of music, where maybe 3 tracks were incredible singles, and the remaining 12 tracks were vastly inferior padding just to justify the price tag.
It's like a restaurant forcing you to buy the $18 all-you-can-eat buffet when you only came in for one specific slice of pizza.
That is the perfect way to describe it.
And to make it worse, the industry intentionally stopped manufacturing cheap cast singles or CD singles. If you like that one hit song you saw on MTV, you couldn't just drop $2 on it anymore.
Nope.
The label held you hostage. You had to buy the bloated $18 buffet.
And history shows us that when you force consumers into a hostage situation over a piece of plastic, they will eventually find a crowbar.
Yep.
That crowbar was the internet. The sheer resentment of paying full price for 14 bad songs and one good one created the perfect powder keg for a digital rebellion.
Enter 1999. Napster breaks down the restaurant doors and basically lets everyone steal the pizza.
Exactly.
And then by 2001, Apple introduces iTunes and the iPod, creating a legal way to buy just the slice for 99 cents. The era of unbundling had arrived, and it was violent.
The technological walls of the album were completely breached. You no longer had to buy the filler. The album was no longer a locked, mandatory sequence determined by the artist.
You know, I want you to think back to the very first time you actually held an iPod in your hand. You suddenly wielded the power to shatter these carefully constructed imagination capsules into thousands of disconnected, randomized tracks.
What was so empowering for the listener?
You hit the shuffle button, and suddenly a Nirvana track bleeds into a Madonna song, which bleeds into a jazz instrumental. The listener seized absolute control over the sequence.
But the economic impact of that unbundling was catastrophic for the industry. Once consumers realized they only ever wanted the singles, album sales fell off a cliff. The industry plummeted from $14.6 billion in 1999 to just $6.3 billion by 2009.
Wow, cut in half.
The media universally declared it the death of the album. Pundits argued that the MP3 had permanently destroyed our attention spans, and no one would ever sit through a full-length record again.
But declaring the format dead totally ignored what the artists were actually doing on the ground. The economics collapsed, sure, but the art form survived through sheer defiance.
Right.
I mean, even amidst the piracy panic of the 2000s, you have Usher dropping Confessions in 2004 and selling 8 million physical copies. You have Eminem and Kanye West treating the hip-hop album as a monolithic, indispensable cultural event.
And in rock, you saw bands actively resisting the unbundling. Radiohead released Kid A, constructing this dense electronic post-rock landscape that deliberately lacked obvious radio singles.
Because they wanted you to listen to the whole thing.
Exactly. It fundamentally demanded to be consumed as a single, uninterrupted piece of art. Honestly, if you shuffled Kid A on your iPod, you just ruined the experience.
And that defiance brings us right into the 2010s, which is the era of the streaming metamorphosis. We move past the iPod's downloaded MP3s and into the age of Spotify, where music is essentially invisible.
It's just floating out there.
Right. It floats in the cloud, governed by playlists and algorithms. So if you're an artist and your album is no longer a physical object sitting in a store window, how do you make anyone care that you're releasing a full project?
Initially, the industry's answer was sheer, deafening spectacle. Because the music lacked physical form, the physical marketing in the real world became increasingly absurd just to overcompensate.
Oh man, the stunts.
The rollout became significantly more important than the music itself.
The attempts to capture our attention in this endless feed-scrolling world just got completely out of hand. You had Lady Gaga unveiling a literal flying dress.
I remember that.
And then there's Katy Perry, who promoted her 2013 album Prism by commissioning a gilded, gold-painted 18-wheeler truck to just drive aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles.
Which is so funny.
And one critic in the source material accurately noted that it looked uncannily like a 10-ton brick of Cracker Barrel cheese. It was the absolute peak of rollout desperation.
It really was. And that level of excessive, noisy promotion inevitably caused a massive cultural fatigue. Consumers were just exhausted by the months-long teasing, and so the pendulum violently swung the other way, pioneered by Beyoncé.
The invention of the surprise drop.
Exactly. In late 2013, Beyoncé released her self-titled album on iTunes with zero prior announcement, no lead single, and certainly no gilded cheese trucks.
Just boom, it's there.
It was simply available in its entirety overnight. She bypassed the exhausting marketing cycle completely, and it also neatly circumvented the internet leaks that had been bleeding the industry dry.
That was huge back then, albums leaking months early.
Right. She proved that if you possessed enough cultural gravity, you could capture the global zeitgeist instantly just by dropping a fully formed album out of the sky.
Now, while the West was navigating this frantic digital transition, moving from bloated CDs to iTunes unbundling, and then from absurd rollouts to surprise streaming drops, there's a massive glaring exception to this narrative globally.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to examine Japan. The Japanese music market presents a fascinating economic phenomenon that's often referred to as Galapagos syndrome.
Wait, like the islands. meaning their market evolved in complete isolation from the rest of the world, just like the wildlife on the Galapagos Islands.
Precisely. While the United States and Europe were shuttering record stores and moving their entire lives to the digital cloud, Japan, which is the second largest music market on Earth, by the way, stubbornly and massively clung to the physical CD.
It's so wild.
Even into the mid-2010s, physical formats accounted for an astonishing 75% of their music sales.
Which seems so counterintuitive. Japan had widespread broadband internet before almost anyone else. Why were they still buying plastic discs?
Because the Japanese record industry brilliantly engineered the CD to be about much more than just audio quality. Japan has a massive idol culture groups like the boy band Arashi, for example. The agencies turned the physical CD into a token of fandom. They would hide lottery tickets to exclusive meet and greets inside the jewel cases. But more ingeniously, buying a physical CD counted as a fan vote in highly publicized, televised popularity contests for the idols.
So if you're a super fan, you aren't just buying one CD to listen to in your car. You're buying 50 copies of the exact same album to ensure your favorite singer wins the election.
Exactly. Coupled with a broader cultural reverence for physical, collectible objects and strict industry price fixing that prevented discounting, the CD remained king in Japan long after it became a relic in the West.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the West actually ended up having its own massive physical resurgence, and it was triggered by the most unexpected global event imaginable, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020.
The pandemic instantly neutralized the modern streaming rollout strategy. I mean, you couldn't shoot a massive music video with 100 extras anymore. You couldn't embark on a global press tour. Live concerts ceased to exist entirely, and physical record stores were forced to close their doors.
It forced a massive adaptation. Some legacy artists panicked and delayed their albums indefinitely, but others leaned into the isolation of the moment. Taylor Swift entirely abandoned her meticulous, Easter egg-filled pop rollouts and dropped Folklore as a complete surprise.
Which was brilliant.
And while everyone was trapped in their homes, this profound shift happened in the way we craved music. With stores closed and life entirely digitized, you'd assume physical media would finally suffer its killing blow. But the exact opposite happened.
Because being stuck inside, endlessly scrolling through immaterial digital feeds all day long, people developed this desperate hunger for tactility.
They wanted to touch something real.
They wanted James Campion's 1970s imagination capsule back. They wanted an excuse to step away from a screen, hold a large piece of cardboard, and commit to an uninterrupted auditory experience.
The vinyl revival went into absolute overdrive. In 2020 alone, 27.5 million vinyl records were sold in the U.S., marking the highest sales numbers in decades.
It's incredible.
Fans of modern pop, hip-hop, and indie rock were suddenly buying massive gatefold records, studying the artwork, and participating in the physical ritual of listening to side A and then flipping the disc to side B all over again.
We have truly come full circle. I mean, from the fragile 78 RPM shellac binders of the 1940s to Columbia's vinyl LP, straight into the darkened, headphone-lit bedrooms of the 70s. We survived the corporate bloat of the $18 CD, the absolute fragmentation of the iPod Shuffle, and the algorithmic dominance of Spotify.
And through all of those format wars, the album simply refuses to die.
As the legendary music critic Robert Christgau noted, making an album is fundamentally embedded in a true musician's DNA. Writing and recording a collection of songs for posterity is an irresistible urge. An artist will always want to paint on a larger canvas than a 3-minute single allows.
It's the ultimate survivor format. It has proven its ability to mutate and fill whatever technological container we invent for it, whether that's a microgroove or a cloud server. So I'd love for you to try something after you finish listening to us today. Open up your Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you keep your library. Look at all those little square album covers lined up in rows on your screen. And really think about the fact that those digital squares are the direct, unbroken descendants of those heavy, brown, 1940s photo album-style record binders.
It's a great exercise.
The technology shifted from shellac to code, but our human desire to catalog, collect, and lose ourselves in a sequence of songs hasn't changed one bit.
Which leaves us with a fascinating question as we look toward the horizon.
Oh, yeah.
We are currently standing at the edge of an era where artificial intelligence can generate endless, hyper-personalized, never-ending streams of music algorithmically tailored to your exact mood at any given millisecond.
Sounds exhausting, honestly.
Right. So in a future of infinite generative noise, will the traditional fixed 45-minute album become the ultimate luxury item? Will committing to a single locked sequence of songs frozen in time be the only way left for an artist to truly prove they possess a human, singular vision?
If the ghost of the 1948 vinyl record has survived this long, I wouldn't bet against it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking for those imagination capsules, and we'll catch you next time.